Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Moving Beyond Demos, How to Predict Consumer Behavior via Psychographics. My name is Allison Little, and I'm on the marketing team here at Simmons Research. I'll be moderating today's session, so let's quickly cover a few logistics before we get started. Given the high volume of attendees on today's call, we've placed everyone in listen-only mode. That said, if you have questions or comments throughout the session, please use the question and answer feature in your GoToWebinar panel. We'll address these at the end of the presentation. As a reminder, all attendees will receive the recording and a copy of today's slides within the next few business days. Now, today's speakers are Tamara Barber, Senior Custom Analytics Manager, and Steven Millman, Chief Scientist at Simmons Research. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Steven.
Thank you very much. Before I begin, I'd like to just say a few words. Thank you to the folks who put a lot of time and energy into this. We're very proud to be able to bring this new product and this new approach to all of you. Thank you all very much for coming and joining the session. I would love to also thank three of our statisticians who spent a bunch of time helping to produce this new technology. Chris Ney, Hu Yang, and Karen Swift. They all did a marvelous job with this. Also like to thank Jen Olson and Allison Little, who announced me a moment ago, for all of their help with the deck and logistical support. And of course, my co-presenter, Tamara Barber, who in many ways is the engine that makes this thing go. She's put in a tremendous amount of effort. Can't say enough great things about her. So let's begin. So the challenge that we face in this modern era has a lot to do with taking advantage of the tidal wave of data that are available and are becoming available, and figuring out what to do with them in a meaningful way. And a part of this is pinpointing the unique mindset of people who might be interested in our brand or in viewing our media as compared to those of competitors, and it remains a challenge. What we're bringing here is an analysis of psychographic characteristics, which offers a very powerful way to find predictors of consumer choice, whether it's a product or a service or a media to consume. And we'll talk about how this is important as compared to what is generally done in targeting, which is focusing on demos. So to help scale businesses, marketers really need to focus their efforts not on the entire universe. This is something that we're all very much aware of already. So rather than going after everybody and hoping that the people we want to reach see the ad through the noise, we want to really narrow down, focus our spend, and try to get the best ROI possible. Part of that is looking for the people who look like the people who buy our stuff or who watch our shows. And that's a very reasonable way to go. And a lot of this in the market today is particularly in programmatic. In other areas, you're looking to buy audiences. I'd like to get women 18 to 55. I'd like to get, excuse me, people with incomes over 75K. What's more interesting, and what to us with respect to this call, and what we're bringing to you, is how do you identify the difference between the people who look like the people who use your product and the folks who are strongly likely to use your product, but don't for whatever reason. And we're going to get into that. Next slide, please. So the solution, it's called Predictive Consumer Insights. And it provides you, among other things that we'll talk about, a way to target likely brand users. And it does so much more efficiently than demos alone. So how does it work? Well, within the National Consumer Survey, we have almost 600 psychographic attributes. And these can be a variety of things, like on a 5-point scale, how much do you agree or disagree with the following? For example, I'm an optimist. I love the idea of traveling abroad. I love to buy new gadgets. We also incorporated RMT's driver tags. So there are about 265 of those at present. And those are interesting descriptors of content, media content. In this context, we're talking about TV content. And those can be used as psychographics themselves. So a way to think of that is what is it about the way you watch television? What does that say about you as a person? Very much the same way that any psychographic will. And then we went through a data mining exercise. We really took a very 21st century approach to data that we've been collecting in many ways in the same kind of fashion that we've been doing it since the 1960s, 1970s, and really applied some advanced statistics to that. We did that through a series of iterations of regression modeling, where we continued to distill and distill and distill until we get down to a set of strong predictors that help to identify brand choice or media consumption. We do this at the 95% confidence level because we're looking for precision, so we don't want to let too much noise in. Standard in market research is often set at 90% confidence level, but we wanted to go a little further. And that leaves us with a set of variables and variables that predict brand choice. And what's really exciting about this is that it allows us to be surprised. Today, for example, if you're to use the Simmons, or I should say yesterday, if you were to use the Simmons data, you might say, you know what, I know that people who really love foreign cars are going to like my product. I have reasons to believe that's true. Maybe I'm Toyota. And so you might put that in, but there's only so many segments you can add before you start creating such small segments that there's not a lot of value to it. So, for example, if I want men who are 25 to 45 who love foreign cars, that's getting me down to a pretty small group, and it gets smaller every additional attribute. Go ahead to click one more time. So one of the really powerful things about this approach is because you're using these models is I can score, we can score individuals, every individual in the National Consumer Survey for the likelihood that they would be a brand user or a media consumer. And we know whether or not that individual is in fact a consumer of the media or the brand. So being able to score each person means that we are able to use simultaneously all of their demographic information and all of these psychographics and driver tags to be able to really pinpoint accurately, not only how do I find these folks, how do I see how they're different from the folks who are using competitors but are still strongly likely to use my brand, they just aren't, or likely to see my TV show. It also helps you by looking at this sort of rich tapestry of information about the mindset of these folks to think about how you would allow that to impact your creative, how you would think about your brand message, how to bring people in. It allows you to differentiate between trying to upsell your current customers, or how to bring in a broader group of people, maybe expand the universe as you've seen it in terms of prospective people to use your services. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So one thing that I really want to highlight is across the board, we see a really significant improvement in the ability to predict brand use when you use these additional psychographic variables. So if you were to just use all of the demos alone, and in this case, we looked at almost 3,000 brands. We selected these brands based on very simple thing, just did they have at least 10% incidence in the US. So do at least 10% watch a show, do at least, I think actually might have been 5% for watching shows, is brand use a certain level. And what you can see is if you just use those demos, it's predicting about 5.5% of the variance associated with the brand use. So another way of thinking about that is there's a lot of things that might go into me buying a candy bar, the general economy, whether or not I have kids in the household, whether it's rainy today, did I go out? Am I a diabetic? What's my health status? There's lots and lots and lots of things that contribute ultimately to my decision to buy a Snickers bar. Snickers isn't paying for me. Paying me for this, by the way. I just love Snickers bars. But if I put all that together, on average across all of these brands, it's only explaining about 5.5%. That means almost 95% of what goes into my brand choice is not being explained by demography, age, gender, income, percent of children in the household, and so on. When I had the psychographics, again, on average, almost 15% of the of what's going on in terms of brand choice becomes explainable. And that's a tremendous increase over where we are today with targeting. The overall gain versus demos alone across myriads of brands, and these are CPG, these are banks, these are television shows, radio shows, all across the board, everything you might imagine. That's a 264% increase in explanatory power. So there's a lot of detailed richness, but there's also just a lot of additional power to this approach. Next slide. When we break this out across brand categories, it's very consistent. Food CPG is the lowest of the group, but as you can see, still a pretty substantial increase in explanatory power. TV shows have the highest explanatory leap, partially because driver tags, by their nature as being descriptors of the kinds of things you watch, are very good, as you might expect at predicting media consumption. Alcoholic beverages, we'll talk a little bit about that. Department clothing stores. You can see no matter what brand category we looked at, we saw strong performance. Go ahead to the next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Tamara in just a moment, and I will join you a little bit later, but it was a general decision across Simmons that I should be kept away from tequila, and given my history, I must agree. So Tamara, all yours.
All right, thank you, Stephen, and thanks for the introduction, and thank you again to people who have made the time to join the call today. So, although the decision was made to keep Stephen away from tequila, nonetheless, we decided to go with this as one of our examples because you know what, it's summertime, it's the middle of the week, and you know, maybe we all need something to get us through the rest of the week. What better than a nice margarita, which starts with tequila. So we are going to walk through an example of how to apply predictive consumer insights and the methodology and approach that Stephen just walked through in a couple of different ways. And we're going to start with how to tap into the psychographics that come out of this and use those for creative and messaging purposes. So we are going to start with looking at some demos for 3 current tequila brands and people who drink those brands, age 21 plus. We're talking about behind the scenes here, 3 brands that are kind of mid-range. Our client brand is a well-known brand name, and this is an extension of that brand. The other 2 brands, between brand 1 being a little bit of a newcomer to this general space and brand 2 being a little bit more entrenched. Nonetheless, these are all kind of on equal footing in terms of the type of market that they're trying to go after. And just looking at demographics alone, we can see that there are some pretty close similarities on things like level of education, presence of children in the household, race. We see a little bit of variation in ethnicity and a little bit of variation in income, but by and large, this is a group of consumers that demographically are very, very similar, and there's nothing that's really going to jump out and say, ah, this is what makes my brand, the client brand, different. On top of that, important to also take the competitive landscape into account here and really kind of play out to what extent these three brands have overlap with each other. So we can do that really easily before we even get started with the modeling process and that data mining process that Stephen described. And we can pull this right out of the data we have today. Now, obviously, just in looking at this graphic here, we can see that the tequila drinking market is relatively slim. So it follows then that these three brands have relative slim and close to equal distribution within the marketplace. Again, remember I had said that competitor 2 is slightly more entrenched, and our client brand and competitor 1 are on equal footing here in terms of size of their current user base. When we extend this a little bit further and look at what the overlap is among these three brands, bear in mind here that the circles aren't necessarily proportional to what the actual size of the market is. All these circles are the same size, even though the market size is going to be a little bit different for each. But the main point here is that there's overlap. People have a lot of choice in terms of what brand of tequila they drink, and certainly in this instance, with these three brands, there's significant overlap where about 59% of people who drink the client brand also drink one of these other two brands, meaning that they fall into at least one of these kind of overlapping categories. So this competitive context is important to keep in mind, and we'll come back to it as well a couple times when we go through the predictive consumer insights data that we got out of running the models. So imagine now that that we've run all of the models and gone through the process that Stephen briefly described in terms of taking all of the attitudes, those 600 attitudes that we have already existing within all of the data that we have that we release on a quarterly basis, plus those driver tags that Stephen talked about. And we go through this iterative regression process against these three brands. What we end up with, and what really is the start and the core piece to predictive consumer insights before we can do anything else, is this development of a segment, and in this case, two segments. I'll explain how that happens, but development of a segment that we call the likely brand segment. Now, in the case of tequila, we have, as you'll see here, the current brand users. So these are the people who, from our data, we know are already using this particular brand of tequila. And we've split up this group of likely client drinkers, likely tequila brand drinkers, into, based on predictive consumer insights, people who drink tequila but don't currently drink our client's brand. And that is this 29 million number that you see right here. We've also peeled off of this, though, people who don't drink tequila at all, but because of their psychographics and the likelihood probability score that they got, they are also considered likely client drinkers, likely brand users. And then we have all other adults here who, number one, don't drink tequila, and number two, are not likely to be brand users at all. So for the purposes of this example, we're going to focus on this specific group right here. It's a different kind of thought exercise if you're thinking about converting somebody not only into your category of drinking tequila, and then also into your brand. So we're going to focus on people who already drink tequila, but you know what? We want them to start using our brand as well. And we can take from this, going back into our Simmons data, we can take a look at what the competitive overlap looks like for this particular segment right here. And sure enough, keep in mind that these are people who don't use the client brand, but they're telling us that about 1/5 of them are already drinking a competitor's brand, competitor 1, and almost 40% of them are drinking competitor 2. understanding, from the dynamics of this particular market that there's going to be overlap. Well, we know that we definitely need to keep in mind the fact that a sizable number of the people who this brand needs to go after are already drinking a competitor brand. So the more that we can put together messaging and content that is really going to speak to what drives consumers to choose our client's brand, the better off we'll be in terms of giving ourselves a fair shot of winning new users over. Okay, so now we're going to dig into what the attitudes actually look like. When we've run all the models at the end of the day, what we get and what goes into building this segment is a list of attitudes and a way to sort of prioritize which of them are going to be most powerful into messaging against them in order to resonate with these prospects who we want to go after. So we've split this up into two sections. This first piece is what we're calling positive relationships. The next slide will, of course, be negative relationships. And we're calling them positive and negative not because the statements in and of themselves are positive or negative. It's because of this statistic that we have right here, which is basically telling us that people who agree or strongly agree with these statements are more likely to use the client brand. For example, people who say, I often go on long car trips or vacations, I agree with that, or I strongly agree with it. Well, that agreement would make me 31% more likely to choose the client brand. So these serve as a way to help prioritize what messaging pieces we really want to be able to push on. Now, keep in mind that there are a number of attitudes that are going to come out of any type of brand that we do this for. And in this particular case, there were 40 that bubbled to the top and were meaningfully and powerfully predictive of client use. So all of these attitudes taken together are going to go into how that segment is defined. They all work together to help us pinpoint the people who are going to be our likely users. And here we're just looking at the top 10 in order to give us an idea of the key parts of the mindset of these prospective users. Now, on the negative side of things, again, just talking about where there's a negative relationship, we say the opposite. For example, people who agree or strongly agree that they enjoy watching religious television programs are 22% less likely to use the client brand. So this starts to give you opposite of what we were looking at on the previous slide. From a messaging perspective, it gives you some clues. It gives you some ideas as to, you know what, no matter what we end up putting into our creative for this campaign, these are the kinds of ideas. These are the kinds of, signals to mindsets that we kind of want to stay away from, because this is actually going to push my likely users away from choosing my brand. So remember here, we're talking about tequila, and it's really hard to talk about tequila without talking about a margarita. So to take this analogy one step further, if you think about the ingredients that we put into a model, in this case, this margarita, if we were to include demos alone and go through this same process, we would only be capturing 2% of what goes into picking that client's brand. And as Steven said, there are a lot of different things that go into the choices that we make on brands in any situation. Some of them we can capture, like demographics, like attitudes. Some things are going to be harder to capture. But the more that we can capture, the more powerful and predictive and specific our model and our targeting efforts are going to be. So in this case, when we included the psychographics, including the driver tags, we get a significant lift in our predictive power, now capturing 15% of what goes into choosing this particular brand, which at the end of the day is a 642% gain in predictive power. So, just as we saw consistent performance across different categories, we see the same thing when we're looking at this specific brand. So let's bring this back to the competitive context, but talk about it in terms of the attitudes that we just looked at for this brand. Now, what we've done here is we went through the same process for competitor 1 and competitor 2 and pulled out all of the attitudes that were shown to be powerful predictors of brand choice for that brand. And these are the top 5 attitudes that were on the previous slides where we had the bar charts, but now we're comparing them across the competitors. And what we see here, and what we've actually seen for really all of the brands that we've looked at so far, is that there are usually a couple of different places where there's going to be some overlap, but by and large, we haven't dug into every single one of these attitudes, but by and large, among the top attitudes, there's going to be a lot of uniqueness to what we find in the client brand versus the competitor brand. There are certainly going to be cases in which, for example, if we have a lot of attitudes that are specific to a certain industry, for example, we have some attitudes around alcohol consumption. Those showed up as being relatively strong predictors across all of the brands. But here, where we're talking about things that are outside of the category, we can really start to see some of the richness and see some of the things that you might not generally think of when you're marketing alcohol, things that you should really think about pushing on from a creative or messaging standpoint. So based on what we've seen so far, some of the clues, some of the places to start with creative concepts might be around cultural nods to the country of origin, to Mexico, where tequila comes from, because we saw that there were attitudes around keeping up with news from Latin America, which actually didn't pop for the other 2 brands. We saw a couple of attitudes on the earlier slide about driving, so including imagery or any sort of creative around the excitement and freedom that's evoked by going on a long car trip could resonate with this audience. We also saw, interestingly enough, this feeling of somebody saying, yes, I'm a passionate, affectionate person. So for this particular brand, it could be that connecting the act of tequila drinking to more romantic moments, more one-on-one moments with a romantic partner could resonate with this audience. And then we also saw within the top 10 that we had looked at first blush, that this is a consumer, consumers who appreciate humor in the television commercials that they see are more likely to use this brand. So keeping the messaging light and humorous in nature might be another tack to take. And all of these, taken together could really be the start to some interesting ideas from a creative standpoint. So there's a lot more that we could dig into with this, but hopefully this gives an idea of really, without doing a lot of digging into the data, some of the interesting insights that you can come up with almost out of the gate with this approach. So the next use case that we're going to look at is switching gears. It's another piece of the marketing process, and that's around media planning and activation. And in this example, we're looking at 3 different retailers who we also consider competitors, with the idea that this is an effort to develop that predictive consumer segment for our client, but then understand what their media behaviors are, certainly understand a little bit of their mindset, but take that to kind of the final step in actually activating this particular target in the ways that it makes the most sense, where this group is most likely to be found. So like we did with tequila, we're starting with looking at the demos, and these are 3 national retailers who focus on fashion and accessories for the most part. They're not considered to be super, discount, but they're not super high end either. These are 3 brands that are definitely competitive with each other. And as we see, like we saw with tequila, there are certainly some obvious ways in which these consumers are very similar to each other. There's a little bit of variation when we look at ethnicity, a little bit of variation when we look at income, but again, nothing that's really screaming out, this is what we need to do specifically for this particular client to speak to what makes them special to their consumers and their prospects. So we went through the same process that we did and that we went through with tequila, and we've again put this in the competitive context. Worth noting here that competitor 2 has quite a large current user base, and competitor 1 and the client brand again are relatively similar. From an overlap perspective, no surprise that when we're talking about retailers, especially retailers who are national and who are competitive with each other, there's going to be a lot of cross shopping going on. And in fact, of the 25 million people who are shopping at the client brand, 64% of them fall into one of these 3 areas of overlap here. So there's certainly a lot of overlap. And again, just sort of goes back to the point of, if you know how to reach these specific prospects through something like predictive consumer insights, your media buy and your media plans and your dollars are going to be much more efficiently spent, even in the context of all of this overlap from current brand users. So we've gone through, and in this graphic, imagine that we've separated out first the current client brand shoppers. So that's the same number that we were looking at earlier. And we've split out the rest of the market into likely client brand shoppers. This is the segment that we've put together based on the model that came out of all of those iterative data mining process that Stephen had talked about. And that gives us an audience of 92 million people who are likely strong prospects for this particular retailer. And we have a group of other adults down here. But like we did for tequila, we're going to focus on this particular group. Certainly for what we're going to go through today, this is a first look. And with 92 million people being such a large market, there are ways that one might think about segmenting this even further. But we're going to start here for now. And in fact, this just by chance looks pretty similar to what we saw for tequila, that this kind of falls in line with what one might think when we were looking at the chart earlier. So competitor 1, there's certainly overlap there. 14% of people who shop at our client brand, who are likely to shop at our client brand are already shopping at competitor 2. And almost 30% of competitor 1 and almost 30% of this segment is also shopping at competitor 2. So the more that we can understand how to choose and plan for media that's going to resonate specifically with this group right here, and might even kind of push on the kinds of things that are still important to this competitor from a predictive consumer insights point of view, but can also benefit us, the more efficient our marketing can be. So let's put this into a little bit of a finer point and dig into some of the predictors that came out of this model. So as we saw with tequila, there are a number of attitudes here. And as I had mentioned, but didn't show on the screen, there are quite a few attitudes here that rank highly in terms of this likelihood to use score. And they're all within categories. So these are the kinds of things that as a marketer or a media planner, these would be obvious places to start for defining a segment. But some of the needles in the haystack that that would generally be harder to kind of understand how it fits into a consumer's mindset without taking the approach that we've taken, are these attitudes around, you know, travel, staying in shape, drinking alcoholic beverages at restaurants, making a conscious effort to recycle. You know, like we did with tequila, these are attitudes that start to give clues around imagery and messaging and creative that might resonate with this group. The other piece that we're going to talk about here are these driver tags that Stephen brought up as well, which have been appended to all of our respondents. And we can see when we have driver tags that are also going to be strongly predictive of a particular segment. We'll get into these driver tags in a couple more slides, but with this particular model for this particular brand, what our approach has been able to do is capture almost 20%, almost 1/5 of what goes into making a choice to shop at this particular retailer. So again, we're seeing that we're capturing more than we could with demos alone, and in fact, capturing a percentage that's notable, and that's certainly bigger than what we would have gotten for demos alone as a starting point. Okay, so bear in mind that this use case is talking about media and how a client could use our data to kind of better plan for media that's going to get to this group. And we start with this overview, just looking at what percentage of our likely brand shoppers are heavy users of these different types of media. And, you know, taking a quick look at this, I might say, well, magazines look kind of interesting because there's a little bit of a difference there, a little bit of an uptick for my brand. Internet, interesting to look at as well, because we know that we want to be able to activate where it makes sense at the end of the day. And although television is on par between our segment and total adults, you know, television is such a broad and varied medium that we want to explore that a little bit further. Because on top of this, our data are showing that this group is ad receptive. In fact, slightly more of our particular market is saying, hey, you know, I'm not against ads. I'll pay attention to them if it's in the right context. You know, so that bodes well for finding ways to plan for media against this particular target. So if we start with magazines, we can easily see when we just take a couple of data points and see that there are specific publication types that resonate more with likely users than with the general population. So these are types that index highly for this particular segment. We've got women's publications, home and house related publications, entertainment, fitness, and travel. Some of these also showed up when we were looking at those attitudes on the previous slide. And it gets even more interesting and more specific from a planning point of view when we pull the titles that have some very nice high indices for this particular segment against the general population. And these titles fit in very nicely with some of these publication types that we pulled on a more general level. Now, because we're also thinking about activation, it's worth knowing as well that this group is likely to be reading and consuming this type of content online. They're 38% more likely to have used a mobile app to consume magazine content, and 25% more likely to have visited a magazine website recently as well. So this is a group that you know, may have some really powerful ways to be reached in the digital realm. So if we talk about TV, shift gears for just a minute and go back to the idea of driver tags, what we have here are the 3 driver tags and the definitions for those driver tags that we showed a couple slides earlier. And we've laid out here, like we did for the attitudes with tequila, where there are similarities between these groups and where, in the case of this first driver tag, it's not even relevant and isn't even predictive of either of the other 2 brands. So this driver tag at the top is related to this idea about sexiness. And with a little bit of collaboration with RMT, we're able to uncover that there are, I think, between 9 and 12 television shows that are tagged with this idea of sexiness and attracting people who kind of have this psychographic and this motivation. So as an advertiser or somebody who's planning advertising, I'd say, you know what, I want to look at making some media buys on shows like this, particularly if I have creative that ties into this driver tag as well. Now, when it comes to the second driver tag, where there's a little bit of overlap with our second competitor, who you remember we have quite a bit of overlap with, this is around being able to better oneself, to better your situation, to improve things in your life. And there are 54 programs that actually connect with this theme. So if our client could build some creative and get some space on these shows that connect with this idea of betterment, that will help enhance the ROI of their marketing for this particular group. And we can go a little bit further on television and pull some other data points around the types of shows that this particular group is more interested in on networks, and then move in on networks, on broadcast networks, and then move into cable and look at particular cable networks where this group over indexes. And you can see that there's some interesting tie-ins here to the magazine content that they were interested in, as well as some of the attitudes that are driving that interest in that content. So last but not least, on the digital front, and really being able to connect this to activating this audience, we can dig into some of our own digital data and uncover that when it comes to the types of website that this group visits on their PC, what's really specific to the PC are visiting house and garden websites. Again, we see this theme of travel and travel agencies and booking sites. So activating on these types of sites through this particular channel might be a good way to reach this group. And then on the mobile front, certainly we have some content areas in common with PC, but mobile is really where this client is going to want to look at multimedia sites, entertainment sites, and look at movie sites like movie trailers and ticketing, etc. So this kind of look and this segmentation that we put together based on Psychographics is going to allow media buyers to really activate these segments and take this particular segment, target it across different targetable, addressable channels. So there's a lot more that we could say on this and dig into, but we've got one more user case to get through. And for that, Stephen, I will pass it back to you.
All right, thank you. So the last user case we're going to go through is going to be thinking more along the lines of content. What is the impact of media content to change over time? We're going to be focusing on what happened to a TV show that lost some of its audience, but this same methodology could be used to look at whether or not changes in branding have functioned. I like to think about the case of Carl's Jr., where they went from a very salacious advertising campaign and shifted to a more family-oriented, product-oriented campaign. And it would be very interesting, for example, to see how that changed the likely user base. Did it expand the number of people who might be inclined? Has it had an impact, and those sorts of things? In this case, what we're going to be doing is looking at a primetime network comedy show. And this is an example of a show which lost some of its audience year over year. And so what we wanted to do is to examine what happened as they went from season to season. Go ahead. So on these graphs, you'll see light blue is the 2015-16 season, dark blue is the 2016-17 season. These are millions of thousands of viewers. So you go from 6 million to 6,000,003 to 5,000,009 in that first set of bars. What you can see is that there was somewhat of a drop off in viewership. You can see just from the demos that it was largely attributable to men on the gendered category. Go ahead and thank you. You can see that there was a drop off in viewership in that 25 to 54-year-old category. There was a significant increase in younger viewers, although a much smaller group as all in. And so you see, and then you think about with the smaller universe of viewers, what happened to composition? Well, you got more of those 18 to 24s, although again, not a huge component of this show. They lost some of the higher income viewers and gained in some of the lower income viewers. That's not where a show wants to be for their advertisers by and large. And a lot of parents seem to be abandoning the show. So that's the story demographically. What happened when you had the psychographics? Well, those demographics really only explain about 7% of what's going on in the choice to watch this show. When you add in the psychographics on top of that, you're getting about a five-fold increase in explanatory power, going from 7% to 36%. So let's look and see what changed. So what we're looking at here are the top 10 strongest predictors among the psychographics for watching this show in the 2015-16 season before the drop. And then in the next column, you can see what the rank is in the season that just ended. What pops right off is that a lot of these psychographic indicators are simply no longer relevant. That's what that ... means. It means that those are no longer statistically significant contributors. Negative relationships are in red. So what that means is, for example, rank 5, where it says, I enjoy watching religious television programs. The more you agree with that statement, the less likely you are to watch the show. So rather than rewrite these to say, I don't enjoy watching religious television programs, which would put it in the context, we left them as the questions were written. So what's happening here? One thing that you look at when you look at some of these psychographics is that again, we're masking the show, but in the show, moving from season to season, the characters, especially the characters, have sort of progressed and matured and become much more moved from the sort of young and financially unstable to more stable roles, more focus on career. And so you can see that there's things like how I spend my time is more important than how much money I make. That seems to have become less interesting. Another thing is that some of these seem to indicate kind of a free spirit. Things like, I love the idea of traveling abroad. When shopping for food, I like organic, more natural foods. And that they are less prone to want to rely primarily on their doctor to guide them on medical and health matters. Those things, again, are gone going into the 2016-2017 cycle. So that's going to be a component of what they've lost. Go to the next slide. Here, what you can see is now the top 10 ranks for the attitudes most predictive of watching this show in this most current season. And again, you can see very few of these were there last year. You already saw when I watch movies, I often notice brand name products used as part of the set, and I use information from my cell phone, smartphone to decide where to go, what to do with my free time. Those still are very strong predictors. The only other one is being a channel changer has gone from the 27th rank to the 3rd. Again, not something necessarily that a person wants to see when they're looking at their audience. They don't want people changing the channels. Looking at this, you can see that a few items pop now that really you wouldn't associate with these kind of free spirits. So for example, they're saying that perhaps uncomfortable clothes looking good in your clothes may be more important than comfort. These are folks that like to drive faster than normal traffic. Again, this cost consciousness seems to be appearing. Because of a coupon, I'd be drawn to a store I don't normally go to. Well, some others kind of remain, but looking at this broader set, these are just the top 10. There are 35 total psychographic predictors from the prior season, 19 total psychographic predictors from the current season. And these combine to give you not just a rich flavor of what kinds of people are attracted to your show, but from year to year, when you see a decline and you're saying what's happened, how can I adapt my content? How could I adapt my advertising? These give you a lot of information that you could work from. There's lots more to say, but I want to make sure we have times for question and answer. Go ahead. So closing, we are introducing predictive consumer insights. We're very excited to bring that to the market. It's powered by holistic psychographics, which is how we describe the data mining procedure and the approach that generates all the data, all the kinds of data that you've seen. Helps you pinpoint and identify your most likely prospects. Allows you to inform creative and content strategies, including your advertising. Gives you a great new approach, new tools for media planning, and allows you to look and see what's happening to your users or your consumers over time, and be able to think about how you might want to adapt that in a very kind of new way to think about, for example, brand monitoring. With that, love to hear your questions, and I will turn it over to Allison, who's going to manage the process of getting the questions over.
Thanks, Stephen and Tamara, for that wonderful presentation. Like Stephen said, we're going to open up the floor to our questions. If you have not entered any in, please feel free to do so at this time in the question panel in your GoToWebinar app. So we have a first one. Do you have any activation product you can roll this into?
Yeah, great question. So yes, any of the kinds of segments that you want to generate with this, you look at your likelihood scores, you can set limits to those scores. You can look for people who have scores like other people, and then you can narrow that down by more traditional elements like age and gender. Those can all be rolled in. We have an activation product. It works with many of the pretty much all of the programmatics that you guys all know and use, and we can roll those right in.
Okay, next question. Do you find there are psychographics and targeting differences between current brand users and likely brand users?
Thank you. Yes. So in most of the cases that we looked at, we do see substantial differences where you can that you could use to correctly target. So you'll see different media consumption patterns. You might see different device use behavior. So it won't be true in every case, but in many of the cases that we've been looking at, you do see these kinds of distinctions. So it is often the case that there's something about people who are likely to use your product, but don't currently, that may have something to do with the way that you're targeting potentially, or with the way that you're advertising, that could be potentially easily updated to expand your consumer base.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we have time for one more question. How is this psychographic work different than if you're pulling attitudes to evaluate a target from, say, the NCS?
Sure. So for those of you who are current users of the NCS, you're used to looking at specific elements. For example, a psychographic. Whenever commercials come on, I change channels, and you'll be able to see how those index. There's a couple of ways this is different. For those of you who study statistics, one big difference is that when you're doing this kind of approach, you're holding constant things. So when you look at, I like to drive faster than normal traffic, that may be showing as irrelevant when you're not holding constant gender. It might be driven by gender and it might be not. That's one way. The other thing that's different is the ability to use possibly dozens of psychographics simultaneously in the way that they generate these likelihood scores. And that's something that would be impossible to do by simply looking at segments or generating simple profiles.
Alrighty, and I think now we have a few minutes, so one last one. When will this be rolled out to be used? In other words, when is this product going to be made available to the market?
It is available today, and we intend, on a custom basis, we intend to build out a more syndicated version of this product. There is not a set timeline for that, but we're working on that right now. But if this is something that interests you, I would encourage you to reach out, and we'd be happy to take you through the options, the opportunities. We can do it today.
All righty. Thank you so much, Steven and Tamara. Again, we're at the top of the hour, so at this point, I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining today, and again, our presenters for giving us a wonderful session. Any unanswered questions will be addressed offline. As a reminder, we will be emailing a copy of today's presentation within the next 2 business days, so keep a lookout for an email from us. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful day.